Hi, Mark Safe here again. If flopping a set in position is a very good thing, then it stands to reason that flopping either a straight or a flush in position can be even better, especially when you maximize your return on the hand. In our last two lessons, we looked at the pros and cons of flopping sets, both in and out of position. The same concepts we learned in those lessons apply to flopping straights and flushes. So let's first look at how you should play your hand when you're in position. The most important factor to consider when you flop a straight in position is the board texture. Do you have the best straight possible, the second best, or the worst? Is the board suited? How vulnerable is your hand? The more coordinated the board, the faster you should play your hand. On an uncoordinated board, you can play your straight the same way you would play a set. That means you should c-bet or continuation bet if you were the pre-flop raiser and action checks to you, and you should flat call if your opponent bets into you on the flop. If your opponent was the pre-flop raiser, you should just flat call and then trap them into putting additional money in on the next street. If they check to you, you should bet and give them an opportunity to check raise you. At that point, you can either call, raise, or even move all in, depending on the size of the stacks and your opponent's tendencies. On a coordinated board, you'll need to play your hand a little faster in order to try to maximize your winnings and avoid allowing your opponent to draw out on you. For example, let's say you're holding 8-9 offsuit and flop a straight on a board of Jack of spades, 10 of spades, 7 of hearts. You have the nuts right now, but your hand is also vulnerable. Any 8-9, king, queen, or ace can give your opponent a higher straight, and any spade can give them a flush. If the board pairs, that can spell trouble too, so you need to play this hand fast. In this situation, if your opponent bets into you, raise them. Trapping here is dangerous, and you might end up trapping yourself. If your opponent checks, you should bet and hope for a check raise where you can then re-raise. As far as flushes are concerned, they are even more vulnerable than straights or sets because your opponent can either make a higher flush or a full house if the board pairs. If you flop the nut flush, you can play your hand pretty slow from position. Another card in your suit won't harm your hand except for the very rare circumstance where it may complete a straight flush. If you raise pre-flop and action checks to you, make a standard continuation bet. If your opponent bets into you, then just flat call because chances are the next card won't be too scary for your hand. If you weren't the pre-flop raiser in the hand and the action checks to you, you should bet if you think your opponent likes his hand and is trapping in order to check raise you. If you think your opponent is scared off by the board, then you can check behind him and see what falls on the turn. If your opponent checks again, you can bet your hand in hope of inducing a call. If you flop a small flush instead of a big one, you need to play your hand much faster, even from position. Let's say you're holding 6-7 of spades and the flop comes king of spades, deuce of spades, 9 of spades. Now another spade hitting the board has a real chance of killing your hand, so there's no reason to try to get tricky here. Get the chips in. If your opponent bets into you on the flop, you want to raise here for the same reason you raised with your set on a coordinated board. You don't want a scare card to come off on the turn or river that can now beat your hand or might scare your opponent off such that he doesn't pay you off. If your opponent checks to you, you can't check behind for exactly the same reason. That means you're going to want to bet your hand in order to prevent a free card from falling and destroying the value of your hand.